Welcome, everybody, to the Washington Monthly Show. I'm Paul Glastris, editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly. My partner is Ed Kilgore, chief blogger for the Washington Monthly. Ed, it's the dog days of summer. Congress is out of session. The president is on Martha's Vineyard.
Of course.
And I've actually, being a creature of Washington, gone on vacation too. So I'm here in sunny and humid Delray Beach, Florida. And I know you're on the West Coast, and usually your computer, your spot in front of your computer looks out over the Pacific Ocean. I'm looking out over the Atlantic Ocean, right as we speak, just right over my shoulder here.
We're very bicoastal today.
We are. But oddly, for a sleepy, vacationing national elite, there's a lot to talk about. And we're going to do that on this show. One of our guest this week is David Atkins, blogger for a number of websites, including the Washington Monthly. David has been one of the few voices out there going deep into some of the issues that are some of the fissures on the Democratic progressive side that you don't read much about because of the massive cavernous fissures happening on the Republican side. But we aim here at the Washington Monthly Show to be fair to both sides. So we're gonna start, Ed, you and I, talking about these great chasms on the great bloodletting on the Republican side, but we'll move a little later into the show talking about some of the problems on the Democratic side. So Ed, I guess the great question all the pundits are asking is has Donald Trump survived his what everyone thought was going to be the next thing that would bring him down, which was the debate last week on Fox News and his back and forth with Megyn Kelly, in which he more or less implied that her anger at that debate had to do with her menstrual cycle, and suddenly many voices were attacking him. What is your sense of the damage, if any, that came out of that for Donald Trump?
Well, it's very hard to say for the precise reason that it's a little bit hard to nail down his base of support and its connection with the Republican Party. When he sort of disrespected John McCain's war record last month, a lot of people, including me, thought that he would then be carpet bombed into submission by every element of the Republican Party. They actually kind of pulled their punches on him, and it wound up not hurting him much at all. And so we need to wait and see what happens with this series of events. What we do know is that the debate, the official debate on Thursday night on Fox News, was basically the Trump show. To an extent I've never seen before. The moderators were going after Trump, trying to take him down. A disproportionate number of questions were aimed at him. We also know that this was the most watched cable television event in history, not just the most watched debate. So it certainly got some attention. And then, aside from the back and forth between Trump and Megyn Kelly and the other moderators at the debate itself, then Trump subsequently started attacking Megyn Kelly and made the sort of comments you were talking about on the Sunday show. Then the next cookie on the plate was that Eric Erickson, the very fiery political commissar who heads up RedState.com, was having his own presidential cattle call this weekend in Atlanta called the Red State Gathering. Trump was supposed to be the keynote speaker. Erickson, at the last minute, disinvited him, in a huge irony, because the man is not exactly noted as a paragon of gender sensitivity, disinvited Trump and invited Megyn Kelly to take his place. So, it now looks like the conservative movement, as well as, or big elements of the conservative movement, as well as the Republican establishment, are trying to take Trump down. Who knows what's happening? There was a snap poll, an online poll actually taken by NBC, 24 hours after debate that showed Trump as strong as ever and actually showed what I'm calling his fellow wacko birds, Ted Cruz and Ben Carson, benefiting most from the debate, whereas the alleged co-front runners, Jeb Bush and Scott Walker, lost ground. I think we better wait till a more a better poll, frankly, comes out to make any judgments about the effect. But at least there's anecdotal effect now that Trump was not seriously damaged. And now we're going to see if the carpet bombing that might have happened after the McCain comment is now going to happen in earnest, and what that does to Trump.
Well, Ed, you mentioned this weekend gathering in Georgia, your home state, of conservatives, the conservative red state gathering in which I think 9 of the candidates at least spoke.
Yeah.
Trump was disinvited. My understanding, and I didn't watch any of that, I don't know if you did either. Hope you didn't spend your weekend watching such things. But apparently Scott Walker, Jeb Bush, maybe 1 or 2 others came away, so the reviews read, having elevated themselves at a pretty conservative group. Obviously, this is a much smaller audience than what happened at Fox, but is there anything from this past weekend's red state gathering that struck you?
Oh, yeah. And in terms of this event's significance, 4 years ago, this is the event Rick Perry chose to announce his presidential candidacy. And it's probably a bigger and more influential group today than it was then. So it's a pretty big deal in the activist arena. To me, at the Red State Gathering, as well as the debate on Thursday night, the big development was what I called the dog that didn't bark. Going into the debate, there was a huge groundswell of demands that congressional Republicans commit themselves to a strategy that went to and beyond a government shutdown to defund Planned Parenthood. The latest, let's shut down the government demand, added on to the others that are still simmering on the back burner with respect to Obamacare or clean energy regs or immigration or, and in fact, Eric Erickson on Wednesday said that he would personally guarantee that the Republican Party was destroyed if everybody didn't immediately promise to defund Planned Parenthood, and that he would personally grill each of the presidential candidates at the Red State Gathering about this. Well, it didn't come up. This subject did not come up at the presidential debate at all. And whereas a couple of candidates,
Fox debate at all, right?
No, not at all. It came up a little bit at the undercard debate earlier in the day, briefly. I think 2 candidates addressed it. Didn't come up at all at the official debate. And then, best I can tell from the Red State Gathering, a couple of candidates repeated their pledges to pursue a shutdown strategy. Carly Fiorina and Marco Rubio. I think Bobby Jindal is on record favoring this strategy. Maybe Mike Huckabee. I know Donald Trump is, ironically. But clearly this was not the center of attention at the Red State Gathering either. The center of attention was Donald Trump's not being there. So it does make me wonder if Mitch McConnell, who has vowed to avoid any government shutdowns, has sort of dodged a bullet here thanks to Trump. And if a August recess that might have been dominated by, conservative activists besieging every Republican member and demanding shut down the government, that might not happen at all. It's an interesting series of developments.
It sure is. Then really, I hate to just sort of repeat what every other pundit is saying.
Conventional wisdom is sometimes true.
It is. We have a situation now where the entire 17 member cast of Republican nominees is essentially not talking about their messages, or at least when they do talk about their messages, it doesn't get much traction or follow-on conversation. They are instead having to answer questions about what they would say to a Donald Trump statement or how they would position themselves relative to Donald Trump.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. And besides, the Trump issues are dominating media coverage, no matter what the candidates decide to do. And then you have to remember that before this whole mess, the candidates were spending an inordinate amount of time, arguing about who ought to be on the debate stage, which led to a lot of arguments about electability, which is a legitimate issue in any presidential primary. You want to know that these candidates think they can win in a general election and have some evidence for it. But you're right, in terms of other than, sort of dog whistles to the base, arguments about Trump, arguments about the debate stage, they haven't been talking much about the economy, haven't been talking much even about Obamacare. So it's been a strange period of time with an awful lot of talk, but not a lot of substance.
And on the Democratic side, and we're going to talk to David Atkins here in a minute about that. What's interesting to me is in the Democratic side, you have closer to a typical situation, traditional primary where you have an obvious front runner, 2, 3, 4 challengers, some of whom might have a shot at best, but it isn't a situation on the Republican side where you have a front runner whom most people think, even his own supporters, can't possibly win, and the more likely candidates, in a sense, being frozen out of the discussion. What you have is a much more normal and, in some sense, substantive debate going on the Democratic side. Most recently, Hillary Clinton's putting forth now a plan for keeping tuition for college students in check.
Yeah, I'd say, it's not quite as narrow and substantive a debate as we had in 2008, when it sometimes seemed that the only thing that really separated Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and even early on John Edwards, was exactly how they would set up an Obamacare-like universal healthcare system. But it's not far from that. We do see the main candidates, the announced candidates. I'm going to exclude Link Chafee and, and Jim Webb from this discussion at this point, because they're not exactly running viable campaigns. But, Bernie Sanders, Martin O'Malley, and Hillary Clinton are hitting a lot of the same things. Obviously, the Sanders and O'Malley campaigns have a different tone, a different rationale for their candidacy. But, we are getting to the point to where you can start doing side-by-side comparisons of the candidates on big key issues to Democrats and particularly to progressives. So I was going to ask you, as an expert on the whole college affordability scene, what Hillary Clinton's doing a big speech today. What do you hear she's going to say?
So the substance of what is in her plan is really quite interesting. And although there are differences between what she's proposing and what Bernie Sanders, who has put out a very somewhat detailed proposal, and Martin O'Malley has announced what his proposal is, but the substantive detail is still pending. So all three of them are essentially saying college tuition, especially at public schools, has risen extremely fast. It is harming the capacity of an entire generation of students to use college as a leg up to enter or stay in the middle class. This is driving the debt deal with college students. There's now $1.3 trillion in college debt. And so the policy goes under the name of debt-free college when Bernie Sanders is talking about it, tuition-free college when Martin O'Malley is talking about it. Hillary Clinton is not going as far as to describe her program that way, but it is essentially the same thing with lots of bells and whistles that we don't need to go into. But the main thing that I think unifies all of them is they're going to take some federal dollars and they're going to offer it to the states to those states that are willing to stop cutting their higher education budgets. What we've seen, the main factor driving up recent tuition cost increases is states, especially after the recession of 2007, 2008, just slashing their higher education budgets. Most of them have begun now to put some money back in, but they're still way below where they had been. That gets translated into both higher tuition, right, for the student, but also into higher costs for the federal government. So every time a state slashes its higher education budget, the federal government steps in with greater amounts of spending for Pell Grants, greater amounts of spending for subsidized student loans, and so forth. And so, in a sense, there's an incentive there for the federal government to encourage states to cut back on their higher ed budgets.
They're
talk about it in those terms, but that's really the underlying dynamic that these plans are touching on. And we have a whole major story on this coming in the next Washington Monthly, so I don't want to go into it, but our annual college guide will come out at the end of this month. But it is very interesting that all three candidates are gravitating toward more or less the same position.
Have you heard any of the 17 Republican candidates talking about this subject?
I have not, and I don't think that will last too long either. So if you look on in Congress, there are plenty of Republicans who have taken pieces of this, and in fact, Hillary Clinton's own proposal seems like a cafeteria plan in which she's grabbed ideas from Orrin Hatch, the senator from Utah, from Lamar Alexander, the senator from Tennessee, Republican from Tennessee, who runs the Education Committee in the Senate. There are aspects of her plan that, for instance, require states that get this money to have higher graduation rates for the low-income students that they accept, that have accountability aspects that Republicans have traditionally favored. So I can't imagine that. Well, the reason that the Democrats are the first out of the box on this is pretty obvious, and that is it does require a major government investment, but and it does sort of trample on states' rights if you take a purist view of that. But the other reason is let's be honest, the vote of millennials, of young people, is a crucial piece of the Democratic base now.
Yeah,
and it is something Republicans should want to challenge. They have not done so yet, but I can't imagine that they won't find one of the candidates or a number of the Republican candidates won't find something to say on the issue of tuition. It'd be fools certain not to.
Before we move on, I'd mention that I believe Hillary's proposal also includes a major AmeriCorps expansion.
It sure does,
which is something I've developed.
75,000. I think she wants to take it up to 250,000. Right.
Well, this is a subject that I've been following for a few decades, so I'm eager to see the details.
Yeah. Well, you'll recall Barack Obama signed legislation in 2009. Raising the size of AmeriCorps from 50,000 to 250,000. Yeah. He only got it to 75 before the Republicans won in 2010. And then the same Republicans who voted to triple the size of the AmeriCorps budget, AmeriCorps being the national service program Bill Clinton implemented, the same Republicans who voted to triple the size of AmeriCorps tried to zero it out after 2010. So powerful was the Tea Party wave that came in back then. So great goal. I hope she achieves it. But an uphill battle to say.
Absolutely. You want to bring in David?
I'd like to talk to Dave. David Atkins, a blogger extraordinaire for the Washington Monthly, for a number of other publications and other outlets, including our friend Digby. David, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good to be here.
Welcome to the show, David. So we've talked a lot about the sort of dysfunction and bloodletting on the Republican side and the serious and responsible discussions of policy on the Democratic side. But it's not all flowers and sweets on the Democratic side, is it? We do have some fissures that are opening up among progressives. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So you've got a number of fissures going on in a number of different ways. The most obvious and shiny Christmas ball among them, of course, is the Black Lives Matter protests. Most recently,
tell us a little bit about what happened, because I don't think most of our audience isn't even aware of this, but it was quite a big deal
this weekend.
This weekend.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot to cover, but basically in Seattle, so it's important to understand, first of all, and this is an important part of this whole discussion, is that Black Lives Matter is functionally a leaderless and structureless organization. It's basically a hashtag. And in that way, it's sort of similar to the Occupy movement in many ways. And so when we talk about what Black Lives Matter did or didn't do, it's a challenge because there is no such thing as the official president of Black Lives Matter and an officially sanctioned movement. It's basically whoever wants to take up the mantle. And this all goes to one of the challenges that the left has in this way.
And Black Lives Matter is an organization or a movement or whatever that arose in the wake of Ferguson and then Staten Island and so forth. And they're asking or demanding what?
There are many things, actually, and this is all part of the challenge. It depends on you can go to a website that has a list of demands that are pretty gauzy in terms of like ending racism overall, ending structural racism. But it tends to be mostly focused on doing something about police violence, which is absolutely an extraordinarily important thing that hasn't actually been at the top of most Democratic policy radars. And that's, I think, functionally the biggest source of grievance, because you have an incredibly large number of mostly unarmed people, mostly minority and mostly black, being killed by police violence in this country, when in most other major democracies, the police kill almost no one. It's a shocking event if even one person is killed, or I think in France the numbers are on single digits. So it's a huge problem that we have basically hundreds of incidents of death by police in this country, and I think that's one of the main issues that is driving, the anger, and it's very legitimate anger. So insofar as that goes, I don't think there's actually a big rift in the Democratic community in terms of realizing that this is an issue that needs to be taken more seriously going forward. Part of the reason you're seeing more of a focus on police violence is because of cell phone cameras.
Right.
People are actually able to see what's going on. And unlike before, where you would have to take the police report at its word, and most people, of course, were willing to take the police at their word, people are actually now able to see incidents where it's quite clear that the police version of events was untrue.
Right.
So anyway, that's the context for this movement.
And there was an earlier incident prior to the incident that we're going to talk about that happened with Bernie Sanders. An earlier incident, I don't know, was it a couple of weeks ago, where Black Lives Matter spokesmen, members, more or less took over a particular Bernie Sanders event. Is that right?
Right. I was actually there. It was at
you were there.
I was there. It was at Network Nation. I was about 50 feet from where it all happened, in the auditorium. Basically, there was a candidate forum, and it was actually not Bernie Sanders at the time. It was Martin O'Malley. But there was a Q&A forum at Network Nation in Phoenix, and Martin O'Malley was on the stage taking questions from a Latino immigration activist, actually, as it turned out. And a group of about 50 or so people who associated themselves with Black Lives Matter came in and protested and essentially, and did a, traditional sort of protest. What what was different about it, and this is part of what I talk about when I write about these issues, is that at Netroots Nation, the Q&A person who was asking O'Malley questions, and they were not softball questions either. One of the questions was, in fact, about this issue of police violence and O'Malley's record in Baltimore, which is certainly fair game to ask about. Anyone who's seen The Wire has seen that at a slant in terms of the way those policies were enacted to discriminate against, African Americans. But basically, the mic was handed over to the protesters. So the protesters were, one in particular was then given an opportunity to go on stage, took the microphone, and basically that was it. O'Malley didn't really have an opportunity to respond, and then he was off stage, and then Bernie Sanders came up. And whereas O'Malley basically gaffed by responding to the protest by saying all lives matter, white lives matter, which is a terrible thing to say, Sanders came up and basically tried to give his usual spiel about economic inequality and injustice, which did not please the protesters. And he was shouted down, and then he basically walked off the stage 15 minutes early without giving his Q&A. This obviously caused a lot of dissension within Netroots Nation, because you had a bunch of people, many of them unpaid, people who do not work for the movement, who had paid a lot of money to travel and come to the conference and to hear the presidential candidates, and had submitted questions on hashtags, hoping to hear the candidates address, progressive issues that don't tend to get a lot of media play, and so there was some question about whether this was appropriate for one issue activist area to come and make the focus of the event about them, particularly when Netroots Nation this year was mostly about Latino immigration issues. So there was a black-brown issue there as well. So a similar thing happened in Seattle, basically.
I would interject.
Were given the mic.
I would interject that Bernie did not help himself by scheduling some meetings with the activists after this whole incident and then canceling them, right?
Correct. Yeah, he left in a huff. No question about it. He was not happy.
And what happened? What was the event in Seattle? What's the background there? Was it a candidate forum?
It was. I don't know actually who was hosting the event, but it was basically a small rally for that Bernie was holding, and it was put together by a leftist group. I just don't remember which one. One of a number of these sorts of things that candidates do prior to their main rally later in the evening.
And what happened there?
What happened, as I understand it, was similar to what happened at Netroots Nation, except it was a much smaller group. It was only a few Black Lives Matter, or people who associated themselves with Black Lives Matter, and they came up and did their protest thing. They asked for 4.5 minutes silence to mark the 4.5 hours that Brown's body had laid in the street in Ferguson. 4.5 minutes, of course, being a very long time, which to hold a moment of silence. And what happened from there is that the organizer of the event actually, again, and this is one of the problems, handed the mic over to the protester, and the protester, demanded a bunch of things of Bernie Sanders and was openly insulting to Bernie Sanders from the stage with Bernie Sanders, behind her. And, and Bernie just walked off, which may or may not be the right way to handle it. But as I said in my post, you only have so many options as a candidate in that situation. You can basically agree with all of the insults the protesters are, flinging at you, and agree and be apologetic, which is not a good idea in terms of the power dynamics of that situation, or you can argue, which is even worse. So, maybe a masterful politician like Bill Clinton could, flip the situation to their advantage, stay on message, and keep the coalition together, but it's difficult when you're prompted with that. What's unfortunate about all of this is that we're basically talking about, for better or for worse, the actions of a few people who associating themselves with the leaderless movement to engage in what may or may not be effective protest tactics. And we can, argue that till the cows come home. we can argue whether a white person like me even has any business asking about whether these are effective protest tactics. But ultimately, I think what concerns me is that we had even more violence in Ferguson last night. We had a situation in Portland where almost certainly a Black Lives Matter activist was thrown in jail for no good cause, while white people who were doing the same things, who were against the Black Lives Matter people, were not thrown in jail. So you still have systemic racism and police violence going on, but we're unfortunately talking about the potentially misguided political actions of a few people that are causing folks to take up arms against each other within the progressive movement, rather than standing in solidarity with African Americans who are finding themselves at the end of a nasty and structurally racist police environment.
David, you've covered a very complicated situation admirably. I just add in that in terms of the symbolism and appearances of these incidents, particularly the last couple. Seattle and Portland are outside of Vermont itself. They're probably could well be Bernie Sanders' two best areas. I think recently when he had this incredibly successful house party evening around the country, there were more house parties in Seattle than a good part of the country put together. And anyway, this is an area where he has a lot of natural strength in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. It's also a very white place by and large. So, the whole idea of Black Lives Matters, disrupting Bernie Sanders events in the Pacific Northwest is, going to look to a lot of people like kind of a microcosm of his and even the sort of the economic-oriented left's problem with the Obama coalition. And that's been the big question about Bernie's primary challenge all along. Can he break through to a minority audience, particularly in the face of charges that he and people like him sort of reduce racial issues to a subset of economic issues? Is that a fair characterization of how this sort of looks to the rest of the country?
Yeah, it depends on the rest of the country you're talking about. That is certainly one of the many facets of this political gemstone, and this has been a challenge going back to the beginning of the new Netroots Progressive Coalition, is that it is very white and mostly male for a lot of reasons. Obviously, you tend to find people. The sorts of people who get animated by wealth inequality charts tend to be, people with more education, people with a lot more free time, and those tend to be, upwardly mobile, educated, white people with college degrees. And speaking as as one such person, we tend to have real disconnects in many ways, talking to and being active with folks who are working class and not white. And there's a whole panoply of communications issues between those two coalitions of the party that certainly could be better handled. And I think it would be helpful for everyone if more folks who are oriented toward Bernie Sanders and that sort of economic populism would get actually involved in electoral organizing and actually go out and knock on doors and, more closely align themselves with labor movements, have more direct conversations with, voters of color and seeing what really animates them and their issues.
David, the big shoe that hasn't dropped, let me just ask this question of you. The big shoe that hasn't dropped is that the Black Lives Matter activists have not so far disrupted or challenged Hillary Clinton. Is that going to happen? And if that does, what do you think will be the result?
I don't know. There's a lot of different explanations for why that might be. Some say that Hillary Clinton has, developed a more intensive, platform about these things. I think the biggest reason, of course, is that there's much tighter security on Hillary Clinton's campaigns. So, if BLM protesters attempted to do the same thing at a Hillary event, they would find it far more difficult. They would not be given the microphone. They would not be given the same sort of stage. In my personal opinion, that is precisely the circumstances in which one should protest. I don't think protests are effective when they're targeted at people sympathetic enough to give you a microphone, which is sort of the point of the post I made this weekend at Political Animal. But I think that's one of the challenges for the movement. You could say it's because they're more sympathetic to Hillary Clinton and her candidacy and her issues. I think it's likelier to be a tactical thing where Hillary Clinton's events are high dollar events, and it would be more difficult for them to get access to the microphone and the stage.
So they're pushing they're pushing on an open door.
Yeah, exactly. And and when you're doing public protests, when you're moving outside of the electoral avenue in more of these sort of social justice protest kind of activism ways, it's important for the oppressor to look like a bigger jerk than the oppressed. And if the oppressed look like the bigger jerk in the context of the event, it's difficult for the activists to gain the sort of sympathy they need to move the cause forward. In my opinion, which is part of why, I think that those two actions are unfortunate, but mostly it's also on the event organizers who hand over the mic. I mean, that's why we're hearing about those two incidents. Otherwise, we wouldn't be hearing about them.
Well, let me make a perhaps unjust comparison between the parties, just to sort of get a wrap up argument going between the three of us. And we began with Donald Trump, who is a multi-billionaire. Maybe it's the 10 billion he says. Somebody with just tremendous wealth, power, media access, and a not terribly progressive view on a whole lot of progressive issues, who has caused unbelievable havoc in the Republican Party. And then you have this small, barely organized group called Black Lives Matter that is beginning to cause some havoc on the Democratic side. Do you think that we're seeing with Black Lives Matter the beginning of something that's going to grow and tear asunder and become a big deal in the Democratic presidential primaries and race? Or is comparing Donald Trump to Black Lives Matter just insanely off?
I'm actually going to straddle the middle ground there. I don't think Black Lives Matter is going to be a major rift. I think you will see a challenge in an electoral environment in which Republicans are attempting to maximize their share of the white vote, and an electoral environment in which police violence against minorities absolutely has to come higher up in the Democratic Party's, firmament of issues. That you're going to see a tension within the Democratic Party in terms of how far forward, because most of the public, unfortunately, still sides with the police in these sorts of situations, which is not terribly surprising. After all, polls directly after the Kent State shooting were 70% in favor of the National Guard at the time. So this is a delicate situation the Democratic Party is going to have to address. That having been said, I don't think you can remotely compare the two issues because I'm not sure how much electoral impact the tactics of, say, Black Lives Matter have in terms of, say, minority turnout or whom Latinos and African Americans are going to vote for. This is a lot of inside baseball within the Democratic activist circle.
I would, David, I would go a step farther than you and say I've been feeling for a long time like ever since the Baltimore protests that the Republican Party is being tremendously tempted to champion a law and order backlash to supposed, lawless minority elements fighting the police. And there have been sporadic signs of that ever since. And Donald Trump was the most recent. I believe on Meet the Press a week ago Sunday, where he basically said, no, we need to give more power to the police. And when you look at Donald Trump's constituency and the kind of message he's been putting out there, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if this is where he goes next. He's been talking about this enormous, massive crime wave seizing the country, and it's precisely what we could expect. That could create quite a feeding frenzy, on the right as well. And I'll just ask you to consider this thought experiment. What if Black Lives Matters, managed to mount a protest at a Donald Trump event? Can you imagine how he would take advantage of that?
Yeah, it would be a challenge. On the other hand, it might be a way. I mean, he would try to take advantage of that, but Donald Trump also comes off as a bully. If Black Lives Matter actually targeted Donald Trump, in terms of that bigger jerk effect that I talked about, it might actually advantage them as opposed to protesting Bernie Sanders, where to most people the protesters look like the jerks. Donald Trump might be so abusive that it would, flip in the protest's favor, and that's part of what my thesis about these issues has been is that that's where it should be taken. Like, Rosa Parks did her thing in the South, not in North California.
Well,
that having been,
David, I just want to point out the irony of all this, and in some sense, I hope it doesn't become a missed opportunity, is as a result of this revolution of cell phone cameras capturing police abuse live so that all citizens could see it for themselves and not have to take the cops' word against the victims. As a result of that, and as a result of quite a lot of under the surface politicking, you've seen, even before Baltimore, even before Ferguson, a movement on the right to do something, at least about the over-incarceration in America's prisons. Maybe not with a focus on African Americans, maybe more about, government spending too much money and the prison guard unions need to be busted. But in any event, there continues to be movement, bipartisan movement, toward dealing with this issue that has not been dealt with for 30 years. And one would like to see that movement continue and not be repolarized in the way Ed was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's obviously one of the challenges when you talk about some of these protests is, do you invite repolarization? But honestly, that can't be on the Black Lives Matter protesters, because frankly, reactionary elements are going to try to do that and repolarize. Anyway, one thing that you can, I think, potentially help get, cross-partisan support for and broad-based support for is if you talk about specific sort of policy aims that should be obvious to everyone. I think body cams, universal body cams, you can't turn off on, for the police, helps everyone, helps the public, helps police as well, and would help reduce a lot of these incidents. But to come back to the theme of the show, I think, and to the question that you asked, at a more 70,000-foot level, I would say that where you can compare Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders and Black Lives Matter is you have a wide range of people from a lot of different directions who are fed up with the establishmentarian Washington consensus answers for society. People understand that things aren't working, and they don't, like, on the Republican side, it doesn't matter, and this is something else I said this week, and it doesn't matter that Donald Trump used to be for single-payer health care. It doesn't matter that Donald Trump gave to Hillary Clinton or can't be trusted on various issues, because what the Republican base, what a huge section of the Republican base, especially the working class base in a country where the middle class is disappearing, just wants someone who's going to be a cultural fighter for them and fight back against what is seen as the wealthier establishmentarian Republican side. And then on the Democratic side, you've got the Bernie Sanders activists who believe that the Democratic Party, including Barack Obama, has not been remotely forceful enough. Had Elizabeth Warren run for president, you'd see a massive fight between the Clinton wing and the Warren wing at this time. And then you've got, minority activists in a country where police have been, killing hundreds and hundreds of people every year, for whom the system is also not working. And, they see folks on both sides, not just the establishment centrist Democrats, but, white Bernie Sanders progressives as well as part of the problem.
And I would add, among minority families, a far larger decline of wealth in the aftermath of the recession than any other group. Hispanics and blacks have just been devastated. Their home values have not come back up, and they didn't have stocks for the most part that have come back up. So you've got a situation where a lot of Americans are suffering, but middle and upper middle class whites, at least they've seen their housing values at least come back a little bit.
Yeah, and so you have a lot of different people that want to see some fundamental transformative changes and feel like not only is legislation not getting passed, because goodness knows we can do the political science till the cows come home on why we have a gridlock system in the United States, but not only is legislation not passed, it seems like, and this comes back to why we blog and why we do what we do, it seems like very few people in the media and in the establishment are even talking about the issues that they care about, right? If you're a white conservative voter who, is afraid of, someone from Mexico coming to take your job, Donald Trump is speaking your language,
right?
In a way that no one else is. If you're, an African American who's worried every day about getting a traffic stop by a cop and having that traffic stop end up with you dead, no one is talking about your issues. If you're interested in Eisenhower era tax rates on the rich and you want to reduce wealth inequality, no one's talking about your issues outside of, that's the problem.
I'll add in that the candidates we're talking about have a good way of exposing sort of the soft underbellies of the party establishments they're challenging. In the case of Trump, the dirty little secret of the Republican Party is that it's one of its favorite themes, entitlement reform, is actually not very popular among rank and file Republican voters, nor in trade agreements, are a little more popular, but not a whole lot. There are a lot of Republicans that don't like those either. And clearly, in the case of the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders is challenging a commitment to trade liberalization or trade agreements, and to sort of bipartisan totems like deficit reduction that most rank and file Democrats have no sympathy for whatsoever. So there are existing problems in both parties that these candidates are exposing, sometimes very dramatically. Bernie Sanders is obviously a guy of high principle who's been incredibly consistent in his career. Donald Trump, on the other hand, I think is pretty much willing to say anything to get attention. That's why I worry that he could wind up exploiting really dangerous themes like a backlash against protests against the police that could, really toxify our political system even more.
Well, let me wrap this up then with a snap poll of our panel here. Ed, I'll start with you. Is the troubles, the fissures we're beginning to see that David has talked about in his posts and today with Black Lives Matter and some other possible fissures, the beginning of something big on the Democratic side that's going to, if not rival, certainly be talked about as a significant issue in the campaign going forward? Or do you think that the Democrats in 2016 will be like the Democrats in 2008 and really debating minute differences among themselves?
I'm not sure, but as a white Southerner, I may have a slightly different perception on this. African Americans have been asked for many, many years to loyally support the Democratic Party and to sort of put their concerns back in the line, because obviously the Democratic Party needs to appeal to white folks to win elections. I think that's coming to an end. I think it needs to come to an end. I think African Americans in particular, we may see the same thing from Latinos later on in the year. We're going to start saying it's our turn to play the kind of role in Democratic discussions that we play in winning Democratic elections. I think that's healthy, and I think Democrats can come to grips with it without too much damage. It could even wind up being a positive for the party. I don't know. Maybe that's over optimistic.
David, you have the last word on this.
I don't think so. I think that by and large, there's a huge amount of solidarity within the Democratic Party with the issues that Black Lives Matter is raising. The challenge has the media play and the controversy has been over a little tactical dispute over whether protesting at Bernie Sanders events is helpful to the coalition or not. But I think there's a huge amount of solidarity, and I think that no matter who the nominee is, and if it's Hillary Clinton, she's already got a bunch of stuff on this, toward a broader implementation of a racial justice reform agenda that goes beyond just economic justice and includes things like body cams for police and tighter controls on how police violence is used and what we can do to make these communities safer, not only intrinsically, but also in terms of the way they're policed. And, of course, housing discrimination and all the rest. I don't think it's going to be a major fracture. I think a lot of what you're seeing internally is inside baseball. I think the fracture is going to continue to be more broadly between the Elizabeth Warren wing of the party and the centrist business wing of the party.
Well,
I'm going to. You're going to see the bigger fracture.
I'm going to agree with David that for the simple reason that the policies that the candidates are putting out actually do speak to the legitimate concerns that blacks and Latinos have on everything from housing to police oppression. And I actually think that the fact that all the candidates are addressing income inequality in rather substantive and significant ways is going to even limit the fissures on the economic side between the Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton camps. But that's just me. And so we're going to call it quits there. Ed Kilgore, blogger for the Washington Monthly at Political Animal. Thanks to you as my partner. And David Atkins, great to have you on. I hope you'll join us another time soon.
Hey, this was fun. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Take care, guys.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.